Hi, welcome back to another episode of So What Does That Mean? Today's episode is why engineering due diligence matters before buying a development site.
Let's start today's episode with something that surprises a lot of people involved in property development. Across Australia, more than half of small residential development projects run significantly over budget. And what's interesting about that statistic is where the problem usually begins. In many cases, the issue didn't start during construction. It didn't start with the builder, and it didn't start with contractors. The problem was often already built into the project before the developer even purchased the site.
And that's something we see quite regularly when people are evaluating development opportunities. Most developers will undertake some form of due diligence before buying a property. They might review the zoning, they might look at the planning controls, they might speak with a town planner to understand what the planning scheme allows. But what often doesn't always happen at the same time is a detailed review of the engineering realities of the site. And those engineering realities can sometimes have a very significant impact on the feasibility of a project.
Exactly, because planning controls might tell you what a development is allowed to look like on paper, but engineering analysis helps determine what is actually feasible to build and what it might cost to deliver. And those two answers can sometimes be very different.
And that's actually one of the reasons this episode is sponsored by JC Engineers. JC Engineers provides development feasibility and due diligence reviews for developers, investors, and property owners who are considering purchasing development sites.
What makes that process a bit different is that the review is carried out by both engineers and town planners working together. So instead of looking only at zoning or planning controls, the review also looks at things like stormwater infrastructure, flood levels, sewer capacity, site levels, and other engineering constraints that can influence the real cost of development.
And bringing these two perspectives together, planning and engineering, can give developers a much clearer picture of whether a project is likely to be feasible before committing to the purchase of a land. Because the goal of due diligence isn't just to confirm the development is possible, it's to understand whether the project is likely to make sense financially.
Exactly. So today's episode is really about explaining why engineering due diligence can be such an important part of evaluating development sites. And we're going to talk through some of the common issues that can dramatically change the feasibility of a project.
Because sometimes the difference between a successful project and a very expensive mistake can come down to information that could have been identified before the site was even purchased. Questions developers usually ask first. When someone first identifies a potential development site, the question they usually ask is quite simple. They ask, "Can I develop this property?" Which is very logical, and the question usually goes to a town planner.
And planners are very good at answering that question. They understand zoning controls, they understand planning schemes, they understand overlays and development approval pathways, so they can provide clear advice about what the planning framework allows. But the key thing to remember is planning advice answers only part of the feasibility question.
Because the more important question developers need to answer is actually this: can I develop this property profitably? Just because something can be approved does not necessarily mean the property makes sense financially.
And this is where a lot of development feasibility assessments go wrong, because the planning framework might allow a development, but once engineering constraints are factored in, infrastructure costs, site works, drainage, services, the financial outcome can look very different.
Reality check for developers. One thing we often say to developers is this: planning controls determine what is allowed, engineering constraints determine what it will cost. And in many development projects, cost is the factor that ultimately determines whether a project proceeds or not.
Because development feasibility often comes down to margins. Many smaller development projects operate on margins of around 10 to 20%. This means if unexpected infrastructure costs add even 200,000 or 300,000 to a project, that can completely wipe out the profit. Actually, that point about margins is really important because the margins on many development projects are often smaller than people realize. Across the property development industry, particularly with smaller residential developments like townhouses or duplex projects, profit margins often sit somewhere around about that 10 to 20%. And that margin has to cover a lot of risk: land price risk, construction cost increases, interest costs, market fluctuations, and infrastructure costs.
And when you think about it in those terms, it becomes pretty clear why unexpected engineering costs can be such a huge problem. Because in a project that has a margin of, say, 15%, and an unexpected infrastructure issue adds $200,000 to $300,000 to the project costs, that margin can disappear very, very quickly.
Exactly. And that's one of the reasons feasibility analysis is such an important part of development. A project might look viable on paper, but if the cost assumptions don't properly account for infrastructure constraints, the feasibility calculation can be overly optimistic.
Which is why understanding the engineering realities of a site early in the process can make such a huge difference to the decision-making process.
The hidden side of development feasibility. A lot of people think development feasibility is mainly about land price and construction costs. But in reality, there are many other factors that influence feasibility. Things like infrastructure upgrades, drainage works, service connections, earthworks, retaining walls, road upgrades, and utility relocations.
And these are often the things that people don't see when they first walk onto a site. You might look at a block of land and think it looks relatively straightforward. Flat block, good frontage, existing services nearby, but there can be a lot happening below the surface that affects development costs.
Actually, that reminds me of an example that really highlights how engineering constraints can change the outcome of a project. A developer we spoke to a while ago had found what looked like a really good site for a small townhouse development. On the surface, it looked ideal. Great location, reasonable land price, the zoning supported the density they were targeting. And from a quick visual inspection, the block didn't look particularly complicated.
Yeah, I remember that one. When you stood on the site, it looked fairly normal. It had a slight slope, but nothing dramatic. And there's something that can be quite deceptive with development sites, because small changes in level across a site can sometimes translate into very significant earthworks costs once you start designing the development.
When the detailed levels were assessed, it turned out the site actually had 2 meters of fall from the front boundary to the rear, which doesn't necessarily sound like a lot, but when you start designing driveways, garages, drainage, building platforms, and retaining structures, that difference in level becomes very important.
And when the earthworks quantities were calculated, it became clear that the project required a combination of cut and fill works across the site. There were also retaining walls that were required around the boundary, and additional drainage infrastructure was needed to manage runoff from the site.
When those items were costed, the total additional cost for earthworks, retaining walls, and drainage ended up being somewhere in the vicinity of $300,000, which obviously has a major impact on a development feasibility.
And that's a good example of how site levels and earthworks can significantly influence development costs. Because unless someone carefully reviews the site contours and considers the engineering implications, these costs can be easily underestimated.
And sometimes that difference is enough to change whether a project proceeds at all. The expensive surprise. We saw a situation not long ago where a developer purchased a site expecting to build 4 townhouses. From a planning perspective, everything seemed fine. But once the engineering design began, a major issue emerged. The stormwater discharge point was located almost 120 meters away down the street, which meant installing new drainage infrastructure through the existing road corridor. That single requirement added over $250,000 to the project cost.
And that's the sort of issue that can dramatically change feasibility because those costs often aren't obvious during the early stages of site evaluation.
And once someone has purchased the site, they're committed to solving that problem, which is why early due diligence can be so valuable. Actually, Joe, this is something I'm curious about. What do you think is the most common engineering issue that surprises developers?
Oh, I'd say it would have to be stormwater without a doubt. Stormwater is probably the number one issue that people underestimate because stormwater design depends on where the legal discharge point is located. And sometimes that discharge point can be quite far from the site.
And if that point is located further down the street, the developer may be required to install new infrastructure all the way to that location, which can become very expensive.
Some of the most common engineering factors that influence development feasibility include stormwater infrastructure, flood levels, site slope and earthworks, retaining walls, sewer infrastructure capacity, road upgrades, and electrical infrastructure relocation.
And many of these factors can add significant costs to a project. Stormwater extensions can cost anywhere between $80,000 to $300,000. Retaining walls can cost $1,200 to $2,500 per square meter. Sewer upgrades can add $50,000 to $200,000. Electrical relocations can exceed $100,000. So when these issues appear on site, they can quickly change the financial feasibility of the project.
The 400K feasibility change. Let's talk about another example. A developer was considering purchasing a site for a townhouse project. Planning advice had suggested that the site could support 6 dwellings, so initially, everything looked really promising.
But once engineering constraints were assessed, 3 big issues became apparent. Stormwater discharge required a 90-meter pipeline extension. Estimated cost $180,000. Flood levels required raising the building platform. Estimated cost $140,000. And sewer capacity upgrades were required, with an estimated cost of $90,000.
So before construction had even started, the project had accumulated over $400,000 in additional costs, and that dramatically changed the feasibility of this project. The sewer upgrade that nobody expected. Another interesting example relates to sewer infrastructure. A developer was looking at a site that had an existing sewer connection nearby. So initially, they assumed servicing the site would be relatively straightforward.
And that's a very common assumption. If there's a sewer line nearby, it's easy to assume connecting to it will be simple. But what sometimes gets overlooked is capacity within the existing sewer network. Just because the pipe is there doesn't necessarily mean it can accommodate additional development.
So in this particular case, the proposed development involved several townhouses. When the servicing capacity was assessed, it became apparent that the existing sewer network was already operating close to its capacity, which meant the local authority required an upgrade to part of the downstream sewer network.
And that upgrade involved replacing a section of pipe further down the street with a larger diameter pipe, which obviously required excavation, pipe installation, reinstatement of the road surface, and associated construction works.
Once those works were estimated, the total cost was in the order of around $220,000, which was something the developer had not anticipated when they first looked at the site.
And again, that's a good example of how infrastructure constraints can significantly influence development feasibility. Because from the surface, the site appeared to have sewer infrastructure available, but the underlying capacity limitations created a much more complex situation.
Which again highlights the importance of understanding not just where infrastructure is located, but also whether that infrastructure has sufficient capacity to service new development.
And examples like these really highlight why engineering due diligence can play such an important role when evaluating development sites, because many of these issues aren't immediately obvious when someone first looks at a property. One of the reasons these issues are often missed is because they're not always obvious when someone first looks at a site. Stormwater discharge points may not be visible. Sewer capacity issues might require investigation. Flood constraints will require modelling.
And unless those things are investigated early, they often only become apparent during detailed design.
Why this matters more today. Another factor making this more important today is the rise in construction costs. Construction costs across Australia increased roughly 35 to 40% between 2020 and 2024. That's a significant increase over a relatively short period of time.
And those increases affect more than just building construction. They also affect infrastructure works, civil construction, drainage works, concrete, steel, labour. All of those inputs have experienced significant cost increases.
Which means that infrastructure upgrades that might have cost $100,000 5 years ago might now cost $150,000 or even $180,000, depending on the scope of works. And when these kinds of increases occur across multiple components of a project, the overall development feasibility can change quite quickly.
And that's another reason why careful feasibility analysis and early technical input can be so valuable. Because the more accurate the cost assumptions are at the beginning of a project, the more reliable the development feasibility will be. Which means the margin for error on development feasibility is smaller than it used to be.
Actually, Joe, this might be a good point to talk about something we see quite often when people are evaluating development sites. And that's some of the common mistakes developers make during the due diligence process. Because a lot of the problems we've been talking about today don't necessarily happen because people make bad decisions. They often happen simply because certain issues weren't identified early enough.
And one of the most common mistakes is relying on only one perspective when assessing a development opportunity. For example, someone might speak with a planner about zoning and density controls, and once they hear that the planning scheme supports a particular development outcome, they assume the project will work. But planning feasibility is only one part of the picture.
Exactly. Another common mistake is assuming that if services appear to be nearby, then connecting to those services will be straightforward. For example, someone might see a stormwater pit in the street and assume the site can simply connect to it, but the actual legal point of discharge might be somewhere else entirely. And connecting to that point might require installing new infrastructure along the street.
And the same thing can happen with the sewer infrastructure. Just because a sewer pipe is nearby doesn't necessarily mean it has the capacity to service additional development. Sometimes network upgrades are required, and those upgrades can add significant costs.
Another mistake we see quite often is underestimating site levels and earthworks. A site might look relatively flat when you walk across it, but even small level differences can require retaining walls, drainage infrastructure, and additional earthworks. And once those elements are included in design, the costs can increase significantly.
Yes, and sometimes developers focus mainly on the building design, but underestimate the amount of work required to prepare the site for construction. Things like earthworks, drainage, service connections, and infrastructure upgrades can represent a substantial portion of the total development cost.
And another mistake that occasionally occurs is assuming that engineering requirements will be relatively minor. But councils often have detailed engineering standards that developments must comply with. And those standards might require things like upgraded drainage systems, additional stormwater detention, roadworks, or infrastructure upgrades.
Which means the final infrastructure requirements can be quite different from what someone initially expected when they first looked at the site.
And that's why due diligence is such an important part of the development process, because identifying those issues early allows developers to make informed decisions before committing to a site purchase.
If those constraints are understood early, they can be incorporated into the feasibility analysis. But if they're discovered later, they can create significant financial surprises.
And that really brings us back to the key theme of this episode. Development projects are influenced by both planning controls and engineering constraints. And understanding both perspectives early can make a big difference when evaluating opportunities. Some pro tips for developers. For anyone evaluating development sites, here are 3 simple checks that can be extremely useful. Number 1, confirm the legal stormwater discharge point. Number 2, check whether the site is affected by floodplain levels. Number 3, investigate the capacity of nearby sewer infrastructure.
Those 3 factors alone can significantly influence project feasibility.
And in many cases, simply investigating those 3 issues early can prevent developers from committing to sites that may have hidden infrastructure challenges.
Which ultimately helps people make better decisions before committing to what's often a very significant investment.
If you're listening to this and you've looked at development sites before, here's an interesting question. What was the biggest surprise you encountered during a project? Was it infrastructure costs, council requirements, or something else entirely?
Before we wrap up today's episode, we'd love to hear from you. If you're involved in property development, construction, or even if you're just starting to explore development opportunities, we'd be really interested to hear about your experiences.
Yeah, particularly if you've encountered any situations where unexpected engineering or infrastructure issues change the feasibility of a project. Those kinds of real world stories are often the best learning opportunities for everyone in the industry.
So if you're listening on YouTube, feel free to leave a comment and share your experience. Or if there's a topic you'd like us to cover in a future episode, please let us know.
And if you found today's discussion useful, make sure to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss future episodes. We'll continue sharing practical insights around development feasibility, engineering constraints, and the kinds of real-world issues that influence projects.
You can also connect with us on LinkedIn, where we regularly share insights and short clips from the podcast.
And if you know someone who's currently looking at a development site or considering a project, feel free to share this episode with them, because sometimes understanding these issues early can save a lot of time, costs, and frustration later in the process. And if you enjoyed the episode, give the video a like. It really helps the channel reach more people in the industry.
Thanks for listening, and we'll see you on the next episode.